It's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, that is Professor Constantin Rothkopf from the Technical University in Darmstadt. He's a professor at the Institute of Psychology and with a secondary appointment in computer science. And he's also the founding director of the Center of Cognitive Science and a founding member of the Hessian Center for Artificial Intelligence. Today, Professor Rothkopf will talk about understanding natural goal-directed behavior as bounded planning in belief stage. Please welcome the speaker.
All right, great. So thanks for the organizers for this conference. I think it's a fantastic title. It's important. It's great to fill the void in the space of conferences. And thanks for inviting me. So let me start with pointing out that it's a very smart trick to call something like a task, to call a task something everyday world task. Because in the field, people have argued for a very long time, well, what's a natural task? So what you can see here is the trace of eye movement of a participant doing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And if you think about, I don't know, perceptual psychology, decision-making psychology, attention studies, motor control, then this is a task that really contains all of those faculties that usually are studied in isolation. So what we are doing in our lab is we try to understand these complex everyday behavior, but we really think about modeling them to try to understand them in a computational model. And so it's nice to call it everyday behavior, but we spend a lot of time in front of monitors, clicking and typing. So why isn't a two-alternative forced choice, you know, a contrast detection task a natural task? So how do you go about this? What are the features that actually make you distinguish between different tasks? So the starting point for us is the old observation that, well, the world is ambiguous, uncertain, and noisy. And there's vast work in psychology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, in characterizing the different uncertainties that play a role in our world. So there are perceptual uncertainties where infinitely many objects can give rise to one sensory stimulus, and one and the same object can give rise to infinitely many stimuli. We know that if we make evidence more uncertain, you have a stronger the prior kicks in stronger. You can also now look at decision-making, single decisions, but also motor control. And of course, in cognition, people have characterized these uncertainties and how they influence behavior in great detail. So what you can now do is you can characterize different tasks by the features of, well, how are they dominated by which type of uncertainties? So you can think about classic, for example, the 2AFC task, classic psychophysics that you would analyze with signal detection theory, right? It's a super successful way of characterizing sensory systems, and perception has been utilized in the neurosciences. It's one of those areas that has been replicated better than anything else in psychology, and you can characterize them in terms of the involved uncertainties. Now, if you make decision-making tasks explicit, you also have actions. They influence maybe the state of the world in a probabilistic way. You have probabilistic rewards. And you can also extend this temporally. You can have temporally extended inferences. Some of you may have used Kalman filters or are familiar with Kalman filters. And then there's all this classic reinforcement learning type of research where you have sequential decisions. And usually, if you look at this type of research, it doesn't contain uncertainty about the state. So people in reinforcement learning often use experimental paradigms where you don't have perceptual uncertainty about what the state of the world is, which is very different from everyday situations. So everyday tasks are sequential, extended in time, their perceptual uncertainties, their uncertainty about the outcomes, and that makes for very specific structure of these tasks. They have very specific properties, and one of the main properties here is that all the decisions have to be done relative to your internal beliefs. So if you don't know what the true state of the world is, then you have to do the inference, and then you do the inference relative to your uncertain internal beliefs. Say memories, your internal models that you have. Okay, so we can now characterize different tasks by their features. Those are the features. They are the computational features in the sense that they determine the statistical structure. And we can then think about, okay, what do we want to say is a model? So how do we want to model something? And what we and many other colleagues that we work with think is a good way of thinking about this is in terms of the 3 levels of description by David Marr. So you can have a description of how you want to solve a task at the computational level. This is not humans. This is maybe, it could be very abstract. Could be something like you just want to do well. You want to do well in the long term, and this is very abstract. It's something like the Bellman equations. And then you can, of course, look at lots of algorithms. Right? In computer science, we're in the business of just developing one new algorithm per conference. So there are lots of algorithms that may be able to solve certain problems. But in this particular case, there's one family of algorithms that compute something like the temporal difference error. And then we can make a connection to the implementational level, where really people have discovered neurons at the dopaminergic neurons at the midbrain whose activity relate to this. Okay, why am I showing this? Well, you can, of course, implement all sorts of neural networks, implementing all sorts of things, and they may be helpful in making predictions. But these types of models here are the models that explain to you why are people doing something. They are the models where, because you can interpret the quantities that they model, you know what the next experiment is that you should actually run, how you can manipulate experiments to elicit different behaviors. So one last step to then show you some what you can do with some of these methods. So usually we are in the business of saying, okay, here's my favorite model, and then maybe if I want to publish a study, I have to also compare to some other models, and then usually I show that the other models do less well than the model that I'm proposing. But actually the problem of modeling is a bit more complicated if you think about, well, the subjects, how subjects go about solving a task. The questions that they have when they approach the task are very different from the question that you have as a researcher. And these types of probabilistic models actually allow you to also model the uncertainty you have yourself about the model. So you can have uncertainty about, well, what is the task that subjects, for example, are doing? In a lab, in a 2-alternative first choice, that may be very straightforward. But particularly in naturalistic tasks, you don't actually know what the instructions you give to subject entail for them, what the task is they're solving. So over the years, we have spent a lot of time developing these inverse models. So it's inverse modeling where you try to infer, well, maybe I'm wrong as a researcher about the cost function that I'm supposing people are optimizing. Maybe people have false beliefs about what the task is actually doing, and I have to do inference over those. So I want to figure out what is the cost function that people actually are using. And just to give this away already, our subjects never do what we instruct them to do. They always do something else. There is some form of rational adjusting to cost. They may be trading eye movements for performance in a task. They just never do exactly what we tell them. And they most often have false beliefs about what the task is actually entailing. And I don't want to look too preposterous here. Of course, other people have also worked on these types of models and developed inverse models in all sorts of different areas. All right. So here's a potpourri of tasks. This could be something like a traditional psychophysics task. If I have time, I'll show you something about continuous psychophysics, which is an interesting new paradigm that allows you to collect, say, perceptual thresholds instead of in hours, in just minutes. That was developed some years ago. We developed a method for analyzing this. Here it's pouring. This is ball catching, navigation, and the peanut butter and jelly sandwich making. And again, you can now use these features of the statistical structure of the task to really try to understand what the structure of these tasks is and what that also entails in terms of behavior. So I'll first show you something about navigation. And this is not navigation outside in the complex world, but it's complex enough in the lab. It's the triangle completion task. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. What is the task? Well, you start at some initial location, and then you go to a first target, a second target, a third target. Then you usually have to wait. There potentially are some landmarks in the background, and the instruction is to go back to the first target that you reach. I'll just show you some data. So this is a participant doing it. This is their first-person view. This is what we can, how we can track the subject, and this is the entire trajectory. So let's look at it. So the participant starts, goes to the first target. Now turning around, looking at the landmark, going to the second target. Turning again to the third target. Now they have to wait with the idea, well, your memory, your map decays to a certain degree. And now the first target has disappeared, but they have to navigate to this, how they remember where it was. Look back at the landmark, and at some point they stop. All right, you can now do all sorts of different manipulations. You can have different conditions. You can have just no landmarks, so people must rely somehow on some self-motion cues. You can include the landmarks, but then put them on a swivel chair while they're waiting, so you're somehow messing with the internal representation of where they are. And then you can have the combined condition, and you can have conflict condition where you rotate the landmarks unbeknownst to the subjects while they're waiting. All right, and there's a really rich literature on this, and I think people in psychology like this because this very simple task can elicit all sorts of different strategies that are described in the literature, how people solve this task. There are lots of biases here in the endpoint distribution. There's lots of variability in this. There have been debates whether participants actually, humans, use cues in an optimal way. Do they use the self-motion cues and the landmark cues in an optimal way or not? Conflicting results about this. And there has been lots of modeling, but believe it or not, there is almost no model that actually includes the uncertainties. So the perceptual uncertainties, the internal map uncertainties, the motor variability, and that can predict, based on those uncertainties, what your biases and the variability of your endpoint will be. All right. So what do? Well, we use these types of models that I talked to you before. So we have now a model that does really compute perceptual uncertainties, combine them with the internal uncertainties. You form internal beliefs, and now you're planning relative to your internal uncertain beliefs that you have. So the task that you have now computationally to solve is you have to do state estimation, that is, find out where am I, where is my goal. You have to do representational learning, what's the layout of the environment, you're learning a map. And then you have to do path planning and control, where should I go and how do I get there relative, again, to your internal uncertain beliefs. Okay. I don't want to bore you, and it's fantastic because there was a talk today, and every time I talk after you, you have prepared perfectly with all the dynamical systems, so I don't have to feel too bad with all the math that I'm showing you here. But so always going after you is perfect. But the simple idea here is we have some way of describing how the motion happens, how really the state evolution is. We have an observation model, so how does a person who's navigating get information from the observation they have? We have a certain way of modeling what the state of the world is, and then all of this can be made more and more complicated. Let me just point out a few things. So the planning of the motion is now relative to your uncertain internal beliefs. We use model predictive control because all of this is highly nonlinear. You cannot do something like an LQG or something. And although this cost function may seem a little bit arbitrary, it's not. You can derive it from first principles. And essentially, it says you want to reach the target. You have some effort cost for moving. And along the way, while you're going, you want to remain oriented. That is, you want to reduce the position uncertainty, and you also want to learn the internal map. And you can derive this really from just trying to do on average optimally on the task. Now, what's really important is you cannot just use some noise, say, the favorite noise of a roboticist, but you really have to include what we know about the human uncertainties. So, for example, we have state-dependent noise that is looking at an object from in the periphery is very different, has a different uncertainty associated with it than if you look at it foveally. We have time-dependent noise while you're waiting. In the memory decay, and we have signal-dependent noise from motor control. All right, so what you can do now is you can simulate this agent, this model, and you can now get trajectories, you get endpoint distributions for this. And if you do this, the first thing that you observe is, well, this model shows all the strategies that have been described in literature as different strategies. So where people have described something like path integration versus beaconing. Now, what that means is all of these behaviors, all of these strategies, they simply come about by the different relative uncertainties in your internal map versus perception. So you don't need to really construct them as separate strategies because it's more, a better way of thinking about it is that the system really finds a solution to the navigation problem and then moves between weighting these different uncertainties differently. You can also look at things like how a cognitive map is being built, that is, the observations of these objects in the environment are learned, you reduce the uncertainty about them, and then they help you to also find the direction to, say, the target, even in the case where you are looking in one direction, but your belief about where you are looking is different from it. You can also look at the model when it's disoriented. So here the model is looking in this direction down here, and now it's turning around towards the landmarks. And what this helps is in reorienting yourself. So looking at the landmark in this scenario here is the only way to recalibrate your own position, reduce the uncertainty from a large uncertainty where you are to a very small one, and you can then use this, well, the model uses this then to navigate to the target. All right. So how well can we describe data, actual data of humans? Well, what we did is we set some of the parameters in the model according to the literature, and some parameters of the model are adjusted so that they fit data from Marco Nardini's lab. So this is a way of doing this task, not in VR. It's not done in VR, but it's in a real lab environment. And we can fit these data pretty well. We can also reproduce some of their analysis in terms of what are the uncertainties here in these endpoint distributions that they had reported. All right, so, but the main thing what we can now do is something new, which is down here, which is we can now, moment by moment, get an inference about what is the subjective uncertainty and the subjective estimate where people are in space, right? So let's look at that. So you can see these ellipses here. I hope you can see them. These are the uncertainty ellipses of people about their position, the target's position, and the landmark position. So you see a little bit of random walk while they're waiting on the position of the objects. And now they're going to the presumed position, the estimate of it, look back at the landmark to correct a little bit, and then that's it. So what you can now do is you can relate, for example, if you're into this neuronal data, not to the position in space, but to the believed position in space, which is really what you should be after. Right? Okay. How well does this model do? We graciously obtained data from 2 other labs in many different conditions, and by and large, the same model can explain these data well. So the model does transfer directly also to these other data sets. All right. One last thing that in the field had been discussed extensively: do people now do Q integration correctly or not? And the contentions experiment where, well, if you have a conflict condition, so you have rotated the landmarks, then the results that had been described in the literature was people use the landmark cues way too much. So they orient towards the landmark cues more strongly than they should based on Q integration. If you think about Q integration as fixed cues, fixed uncertainties between the 2 conditions. But really what's happening, right, in this model is that sequentially you are updating these uncertainties. They are continuously changing over time, and that you continuously have to adapt. And this is predicted, so it does match in this continuous planning and uncertainty computation model. It does match the data that we observe in the experiments. And why is it, as I described before, people use the landmark cues because it's the only way to recalibrate their own position, that is, reduce the uncertainty about where am I and where I'm headed. All right, so this was just where they are, the position where they are. So what about something like perception? Now, if you look in the literature, then often you find something like a description of sequential behavior that is something like, oh, well, you have some prior uncertainty, then you have some sensory processing, you get some posterior, then maybe you have a goal, so you apply some goal function, there is an action that's being selected, and then sequentially you do the same thing over. This is completely wrong. It's so wrong, it's so bad, it gets actually a name in engineering. It's certainty equivalent control. So you should never do perception, decision, action, and then start over. This is so bad. Why is it so bad? Because perception is active. If you have a lot of uncertainty, maybe you should even go away from your target, do something that is costly, but if it helps you reduce the uncertainty, then in the long run, it will help you achieve your goal. So the planning is not relative to what you believe the true state of the world is. The planning should always be relative to your uncertainty. So this sensation, decision, action works for trial-based situations, but not for the real world, for real-world tasks. Okay, so let's look at what people actually do. Here you can see 2 participants who are very different in their way how they solve this task, this triangle completion task. Here you have somebody who maybe, I don't know, they had a party last night and they just want to get done with this experiment pretty quickly. And here you have the A-star undergrad psychology student who is really trying hard to have a very small endpoint error and looking all the time, where am I exactly, where are the landmarks? I don't want to get disoriented. I want to really do well on this task. So you can now characterize this by looking at when during the navigation were people looking at the landmarks in the back. You can quantify this, and you can now find an index of active sensing. So when did people really just look at the target, or when were they also really trying to rotate their entire body to look in a different direction to get information from the landmarks? And what you can see here is that happened here during the first segment and the third segment. They really actively rotated their body away from where they wanted to go to gain more information. We can now look at the variability in fixations to the landmarks across our participants, and we can find a relationship that describes this. That is, if you have fixated more, how have you done this? Well, you have really achieved this by rotating your body. Why is this important? Well, it's important because the rotation introduces a lot of uncertainty in your estimation of where you are and where you are headed. So what you can see here is that these rotations towards the landmarks are what really drives looking at these objects. Okay, we can now characterize this subject by subject, and we can now look also at the endpoint error that results from these different amounts of rotating. So that's what we can see. That's the response variability of the endpoints where they land. And again, we can now try to relate this to how much they have been looking at this. And what you can see here is not really a linear relationship because there is a certain amount of looking at these landmarks, and after that there is no gain that you have additionally for looking more. And that's maybe surprising, maybe not. Also what the majority of the participants actually do. They don't look more than they need to, but they find exactly that sweet spot. All right. So now we can look also at the different segments. We can look at the 50% better performing and worse performing subjects. And what we can see is that really it's the second and the fourth segment that make all the difference in performance. Okay, how can we explain this? Let's look at the data. So this is the data that we record, right? So here we have the linear velocity, the heading velocity, the head gaze velocity, and here we have again quantified when they look at these landmarks. So this is one trial, a trace of this. Now with the computational model, what we can get is their internal uncertainties. So we can now quantify how much heading uncertainty is incurred by a subject when they rotate their head. And you see that this is really what hurts you the most. So rotating your head is a bad thing in terms of the uncertainty about where you are and where the objects are and where you are headed. So that's what really hurts you in finding and going in the end to the location, the presumed location. But there's something else that you can see, which is the uncertainty about the arrangement of the objects. So the layout, the map, that is reduced in the beginning by these head movements. So what that means is we can now identify situations where you do rotate the head, you're doing something that hurts you in terms of the uncertainty, what is not helping you, you think maybe in the short run in achieving your goal. But what it is, this is active learning. You reduce the uncertainty about the layout, and then you can later use the reduced uncertainty about the layout. You can use your map then, and now rotating the head doesn't incur the cost because you can mitigate it by reducing the uncertainty about where you're going. And of course, this is now the big reveal. This is not a human subject anymore, but this is really what the simulation of the computational model gives you. So the computational model really gives you an explanation for why and when they do their head movements. It predicts when people on the trajectory do these eye movements, and it separates them out in terms of active learning and active sensing. All right. I have something like 20 seconds, so I don't show you the continuous psychophysics task, but what I can show you is where tasks that we have now use the same logic, the same modeling for characterizing how people pour a cup of coffee. If you talk to a roboticist, you get an appreciation how difficult this task is if you have to do it really guided just by the eye. Another task is ball catching. Let me show you ball catching. There's a long discussion about whether people use just some heuristics, some rule of thumb rules, geometric rule to intercept these moving targets. And what we could show with these models is that that's not what they do. It's actually a pretty complex model, internal model that they're using for catching these balls. All right, so computational models, these normative computational models have the advantage of explaining the reason for navigational strategies. They characterize the errors. They reconcile previous accounts of perceptual cue integration, whether it works or not. And we use these different types of uncertainties in the model to make it work. And humans actively shape through their actions the uncertainties over time. It's really the perception, action, and cognition are intertwined in these natural tasks because all of these all these uncertainties interact sequentially over time. All right, and with that, I have to thank the people who do the work in the lab and funding for our research. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for an amazing talk. I was wondering if you look at the area of the uncertainty in either the position of the target or the person's perception of the position themselves, can you get an accurate estimate of that in real time? And can you see it change as they would say, look at a reference?
The answer is yes. So that is exactly this, right? Because you have this trace now from the rotation of the head, you can get an uncertainty, the moment-to-moment uncertainty that they have internally about the head rotation or the position. Yes.
Awesome.
Right? And so, I mean, if you think about it in terms of you want to relate maybe neuronal recordings to navigation, this is giving you at least, let's say, let's be careful, a regressor, what their internal belief is about where they are, not where you as a researcher measure them to be in space.
Awesome, thank you.
And I would like to ask all the speakers of the session to come back up to the panel. We're going to start our general discussion. One theme in all of your talks is, of course, computational model. What I want to ask about something else is visual feedback or user interface feedback that is somehow in all of your talks, whether it's like interacting with the GPT or an app or visual feedback in navigation. That seems to be like another theme in addition to the computational theme. So can you like touch upon that to get started?
Well, visual feedback is super important, obviously, right? In all of our stress sensing work, we found very early on that if you start showing people they're stressed out, they get more stressed out. So you don't want to do that. So you want to do the opposite almost. You want to like help them understand when's a good time to not, to prepare to not be stressed out later, right? So we had to learn that the hard way. And yeah, there's some user interfaces we've designed that are just kind of more childlike, not professional enough. And I found that unless you make the user interface super professional, very polished, people won't use it. Parent Guardian was a great example. I didn't say that during my talk, but it was so well designed. It was very cartoonish, but it was very easy to remember. It was kind of iconic in terms of the intervention visual descriptions. And that's why the parents were able to memorize it really quickly. So yeah, it's super important.
I guess I would just sort of trying to like almost tie the themes together. For me, there's you want to target the like where people what they want from it, right? And it almost gets like their belief states to like the kind of beliefs they're trying to extract about it. So as we've been trying to develop interfaces for our clinicians, and even just kind of exploring this, it's going to look very different for different types of clinicians, right? So like a physical therapist is probably going to want an interface that still exposes the most data, but like less than maybe a biomechanist. And then you might have like the rehabilitation physician might want a little bit more information, maybe how it pertains to function. And then I could easily imagine in like PCP or neurology clinics, well, neurologists I don't want to speak to, but like PCPs would probably want an interface that very much looks like an alert. Just like someone walks in, hey, we've identified a new movement impairment. Like either this looks like the kind of thing where they should go to physical therapy, or this seems like the kind of thing they should go to a neurologist. And so I do think there's, and this kind of gets to the human-centeredness, right, as well. Like, so being very thoughtful about the interfaces. And I guess that's more interfaces than feedback, right? Because then when you get into like neurorehabilitation, there's like, EMG biofeedback, motor biofeedback. And then you really need to be embracing like what are the motor learning principles you're trying to derive, and then does that, the way you provide that feedback, like really induce those principles?
I think people are so, I mean, we have this idea of images, and we always think in terms of images. And I think when you look at natural behavior, if you look at what is the image on the back of the retina, if you're into eye tracking and you see this for the first time, you get this appreciation, oh, that's not an image, right? So somehow culturally we think about these images and we do computer vision on the images, but what people process that's so different. And I think in these tasks, you get this appreciation how much the input is convolved somehow with your internal model, how a single eye movement may extract something and not process the image at all. There's some beautiful experiments in virtual reality where you can exchange all sorts of properties of objects while people are interacting with them. If those object properties are not relevant for the task, people don't notice. You can change the texture, the color, you can change all sorts of things. They continue doing something with these objects. It's fine if the task if it's not relevant for the task. So I think we tend to have this cultural idea of images and vision. And of course, it's relevant if you're looking at an interface on a computer monitor, but really this visual processing is very, very different, particularly in natural tasks.
I love that one illusion where you give that, it's that video where you ask people to count the number of times a basketball is passed, and then as it's playing, like this monkey just walks in, this person in a monkey suit just walks in, does a little dance, and like most people just don't see it, right?
Awesome talks, by the way. I just had a question regarding the use of AI and emotional well-being. So whenever I'm not a student, I work in special education, and a lot of the models that you discussed, like the parent guardian and the pop therapy, I felt like they would be very useful in the educational setting. And I know that you mentioned that you're not sure what it would look like if children had like access directly to the AI models, but I was wondering what it would look like in maybe an educational setting where teachers could use these models to detect meltdowns that may occur, or have just an assistant whenever students are getting very overwhelmed in the classroom.
Yeah, that's an application we talked about a lot. to really help students learn optimally. We want them at that right place in the Yerkes-Dodson curve, right? We don't want them to be bored. We want them to be engaged. So you could definitely use this kind of technology there. We also applied it to doctors. Turns out oncologists get less and less empathic the longer they are a doctor, because they have to tell people all this bad news for so long, so their bedside manner goes down. I don't know if that's true for teachers too, but we used some of these techniques to train doctors to be more empathic to their patients, to at least make them aware of when they weren't. And that was extremely helpful. So yeah, I think you could definitely apply it in the education space. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's been a really depressing theme I've seen for a number of the AI language models when there've been like head-to-head double-blinded trials of an AI chatbot versus a physician. Not only are the chatbots often like outperforming in terms of like diagnostic accuracy, but they like crush the physicians in terms of empathy. Now I think a lot of that's like a chat interface, right? And you got this one thing that has like infinite tolerance for typing incredibly long curated speech, and then I know I get bored typing, but.
I have a question from online. So this is toward Professor Rothkopf. How central is active perception, such as eye movements or exploratory behavior, to updating belief states in natural settings? Could this be modeled or measured meaningfully in complex environments like cities or neighborhoods without landmarks?
So, I mean, I think if you look at the psychological literature, people pretty early on picked up on this idea that somehow vision, particularly, is not passive, right? But it's tricky, I think, to quantify these things and to answer such a question if you don't have a model. Without a model, it's very difficult to say, well, was this eye movement, what was its purpose? So, of course, we don't always know what people's goals are when they are going, I don't know, shopping, to an appointment, just taking a walk out there in a cityscape. But I do think that's the way to go. So that's what we are also working on. I briefly mentioned the inverse modeling. So often we have experiments where we try to figure out what are the goals that people have in naturalistic behavior. So I think it's possible. It's difficult because we cannot characterize fully, well, what are the uncertainties they are dealing with. And landmarks, it's not landmarks only like a church, a big landmark, but many things are used as landmarks for people to orient themselves. So yes, absolutely, it should be possible. The question is how to model it. But we're working on it. And others are working on it too, of course.
Thank you. I wondered if you guys had an opinion on the kind of trust and the buy-in of people when we're kind of trying to look at everyday tasks, but we're using, an online chatbot or a task that's in VR, for example, and how that's people's experience of that is changing over time. So, for example, if you rotate a landmark in the task, and people are like, oh, well, that wouldn't happen in the real world. Like, how is that informing people's behaviors, and we're judging how people will behave in the real world when these things don't normally happen? Or, for example, if the chatbot says something that they don't agree with, if there's an immediate, like, well, I don't trust this anymore, how do we keep people kind of engaged in that, and how is that changing over time as we become more reliant on technology?
I actually did an experiment on that a long time before AI got so popular. I looked at an AI system that would give you advice on a puzzle called Boggle. And if the advice was 80% correct, even when it went down to 20%, like after 10 minutes, it started just saying really wrong things, users kept using it. But if it started out at 20%, after 10 minutes, they wouldn't even use it anymore, right? And we looked at trust in other ways too. We looked at things like beauty and things like that in agents. People are very finicky. If an AI system doesn't work out the box, I think it's not going to be trusted and it won't be used. So you have to make sure that these things are very trustworthy. We did a lot of work on that, honestly.
I mean, I guess I would also just say in the biomechanics space too, at the other extreme, sometimes those things that are non-physiological or plausible are therapeutic. And so like, it's funny, there's some perturbation study papers I've read where they were trying to use it as a readout on the status of the nervous system, but plasticity was so pronounced that like single trial perturbations, and then people's behavior totally changed, right? But then that can actually be used therapeutically to change behavior in the real world and make people more robust to falls.
Yeah, you nailed it exactly. There was one data point that on all the slides wasn't modeled correctly. That was when the landmarks were rotated 115 degrees. And what happens in that condition, participants in the beginning, they may think, oh, something is funny here. But towards the end of that session, that block of trials, they totally don't rely on the landmarks anymore because they're thinking, these psychologists are just playing some trick on me. I completely disregard the landmarks. So, yes.
Thank you. It's fantastic comments and answers. Let's thank the speakers again. With that, we're at time, and we're going to go to lunch break.